Hello, my name is HaeRan Shin. I'm teaching in the Department of Geography at Seoul National University. Today I'm going to talk about Joseonjok, Korean Chinese, who live in China, and their roles as mediators in the Korean companies in Qingdao. So the title is Muddling Through in Practicing Transnationalism. So I'm using the concept of a muddling through, which I'm going to explain later in details. Through the concept, I'm looking at the Joseonjok's evolving roles as mediators in the transnational enterprises of Qingdao. My research question is, how is transnationalism by individuals practiced and transformed in the process of new encounters stimulated by globalized capitalism and geopolitical shifts? So I'm looking at the process in which Joseonjok mediators and Korean CEOs and Han migrant workers meet together in the companies in Qingdao, and how the Joseonjok's mediating role worked out and how it evolved as time went on. I'm also looking at the key role of adaptation in struggles with the transnationalizing process. So I'm looking at I see the transnationalism not as a status but as a ongoing process. So in the process, negotiations and renegotiations are constantly made. Let me explain about Qingdao and Joseonjok first. Qingdao is a rapidly growing city in the Shandong Peninsula. You can see the red area, and that is quite close to South Korea. So that is part of the reasons why South Korean businessmen moved to the city. And this city has had a long history of having transnational economy. Joseonjok refers to ethnic Koreans. Their ancestors migrated to China between the 1990s and the 1950s to avoid Japanese colonization and hunger. And actually, they didn't really migrate to China. They moved to north. They escaped. But then after that, the national boundary, the Chinese territory was established. So they have lived there as ethnic minorities. And they have been concentrated in Yanbian ethnic enclave on autonomous prefecture. It is located just north of the border with North Korea, and that belongs to Jilin province. And Joseonjok have kept their Korean language, education, and culture to some degree. And I'm looking at the second generation or the third generation of Joseonjok in this study. Some of them went to Joseonjok school, and some others went to Chinese school. This is about Joseonjok's diaspora. It is quite significant. 2 out of 3 Joseonjok who lived in the northeast area of China have out-migrated since 1992. In 1992, the MOU between China and South Korea was made. So a big number, 470,000 Joseonjok migrated to South Korea, and to Qingdao, you see the number 18. So it means that 180,000 Joseonjok migrated to Qingdao. it was highly related to the movement, mobilities of Korean companies to Qingdao. Transnational small businesses from South Korea moved to the city to take advantage of cheap labor and locational benefits. And then they hired Joseonjok as managers to mediate the communication with Han rural migrant workers, 농민공. So you can see the 농민공 migrant workers who work on jewelry, and then probably somewhere there are managers, and many of them were Joseonjok. So these are three sets of actors: South Korean entrepreneurs, Joseonjok managers, and Han rural migrant workers were the human face of transnationalism within the structural and logical extension of global capitalism. And the Korean entrepreneurs who are of the same ethnic groups but from a capitalist society expected Joseonjok to be in the middle between them and the Han migrant workers. And because of that, new opportunities and new threats emerged to Joseonjok. So if I ask research questions again in the specified context, first, hired as managers by transnational Korean entrepreneurs as managers, how did the transnationalism of the Joseonjok evolve? And second, what were the consequences of their increased adaptation of Korean entrepreneurs and the local migrant workers on the role played by Joseonjok? And the findings are quite interesting. This study contributes to the understanding of spatial and temporal dynamics of transnationalism and the importance of social interaction under conditions of transnationalism. So I want to argue that transnationalism is ever evolving and challenging existing boundaries and giving rise to new ones. And one implication is that transnationalism works in this way to other migrants and even general populations. Before I go into the theoretical framework, let me briefly explain the assimilation theory and the transnationalism theory. The assimilation theory was argued by Chicago School. They argued that immigrants, transnational migrants, will and should assimilate to the mainstream of a receiving society. So if you migrated to the UK, you will and you should act like the British, the majority, and you will and should sound like the British. So the criteria of immigrant success is the level of assimilation. And it is important because in terms of the integration of a receiving society. And the immigrants' concentration, the ethnic enclave or receiving community, will disappear as time goes on because they wouldn't stay there any longer. Transnationalism emerged criticizing the assimilation theory in the 1990s. It can be best expressed as I am here and there at the same time. Here is the receiving society and there is the sending society. So even if I migrated to the UK, part of me is in my home country or home region, city. And then they argue that these scholars argue that developing transnationalism is immigrants' reality. We can't really deny it, and it should be respected. So they should not be forced to assimilate more than they want to. And then in this theory, immigrants' community, ethnic enclave, is maintained and even developed. So right now, transnationalism is quite dominant. And then I'm proposing the concept of modeling through because I think that the transnationalism doesn't just exist as a dual identity status. It is an ongoing process, and the process is not really smooth. It's clumsy. The concept of modeling through has been used in the area of public administration and planning and in businesses. It was about process of decision making and problem solving. The concept has challenged the rational comprehensive model and also the incremental model, because both models assume that there is an aiming point. So we go from A to B, and then we figure out what would be the most efficient ways. Or incremental model would mean that we figure that out in terms of a short term. The concept of a modeling through refers to the clumsy form, rather clumsy forms of problem solving through which organizations, individuals, and society finally adjust to dramatic changes and challenges that we do not necessarily expect. So it is about navigational decision making and problem solving in precarious conditions. My research methods include in-depth interviews, focus groups, archives, and site visits. And for the data analysis, I use qualitative and semiotic approaches. I conducted 21 interviews with Joseonjok and 6 interviews with Korean CEOs and managers in Qingdao, and I saw the flow of consequences of life events that were expressed in the interviews and the focus groups for the analysis. When I visited a factory in Qingdao, it was just like that. Han migrant workers were working on jewelries or some other components, and then there were Joseonjok managers and Korean CEOs. We can say that there were 3 stages of China-South Korea relations. In the first stage, the two countries' the relationship was rather antagonistic. It was because of the friendship between China and North Korea and the friendship between the United States and South Korea. And the second stage started in 2000, in 1992, when China and South Korea had an MOU. At that time, the relationship of the two countries significantly improved, and a number of Korean entrepreneurs started businesses in Qingdao, mainly because of the locational benefits. But many of them failed. And they realized that there should be someone who plays a role of a mediator. So in the third stage, in the 2000s, the benefits of cheap labor decreased, but domestic migration by Joseonjok out of their concentration, including Yanban, to big cities, including in Qingdao, became increasingly popular. So it was the time of China's economic growth. And then this is a second attempt of South Korean businesses doing business in Qingdao. The Joseonjoks, who worked as managers, experienced a new stage of their transnationalism. Well, their ancestors were driven to migrate due to geopolitical forces such as Japanese colonization, the establishment of Chinese territory, and ethnic minority policies in China. And these Joseonjok, as a second generation or third generation, had their transnationalism as a quite inactive form, because they worked, because their language of the Korean language used was usually mainly at home, and then they didn't have a professional transnational practices before. So it was this kind of a change really challenged their inactive transnationalism. So in transnational ethnic business mediation, they really muddled through. They had to mediate between different languages and between different worlds, like everyday life versus professional life, and different culture, Chinese culture and Korean culture. Because the mediating required an understanding of both the Korean capitalist system and Qingdao's business culture. But these Joseonjok, living in the countryside of a socialist country, haven't really been involved in any businesses before. So their move from Yanbian to Qingdao forced them to muddle through changes that geopolitical shifts have brought about. And then they lost their faith, and then they got embarrassed in the process. So the process of facing all of these changes involved psychological turmoil. And then later, many of these Joseonjo gave up on the role, and then they refused to work as managers. And so their practicing transnationalism was a process of trial and error. They couldn't understand business jargon. They couldn't understand the different meanings of some Chinese characters in the business context from what Koreans were used to. And then they were quite unhappy with the hierarchy and discrimination against Han workers as well as themselves in Korean companies. So when I met them, Joseonjok managers and Korean entrepreneurs, from both sides, they were quite unhappy criticisms and complaints. One Joseonjok manager said, I think Korean companies took great advantage because income was cheap and migrant entrepreneurs needed mediators between them and local workers. But in this city, Korean companies can rely on Joseonjok. In most cases, we are Joseonjok. We are of the same ethnic groups. So we genuinely cared about them. So we worked hard for our Korean bosses. But many Korean bosses were very arrogant and they treated us badly. And one Korean entrepreneur said, Joseonjok have no sense of responsibility. They work in a place for 6 months and leave, in many cases, for South Korea. This is their home ground, so Koreans cannot act freely. They are also conscious of the Han Chinese because they are a majority. With long-term experience, the Han can threaten or control Joseonjok. So both of them were upset when they talked about their experiences. And Joseonjok's transnationalism was quite complicated. They were ethnic Koreans, but bear Chinese nationality. So they are transnational in terms of nationality to South Koreans, and they are transnational in terms of ethnicity to the Han Chinese. And the Korean entrepreneurs expected Joseonjok to take their side because they relied on Joseonjok as being co-ethnic, and so they expected loyalty from them. But Joseonjok regarded themselves as Chinese nationals, like the Han, and then their self-identity as migrants was weak. And then they were also changing business environments. As the economy of China dramatically increased, the labor costs and living expenses also increased. So Korean entrepreneurs, they moved to other Asian countries for cheap labor and lower living expenses, such as Vietnam and Myanmar. And then business regulations got strengthened and minimum income got increased. So the business environment for Korean enterprises became less friendly, especially if they want to really utilize cheap labor in a bad environment. So they started restructuring Korean businesses, and then they started to learn how to communicate with Han Chinese workers by themselves without mediators. And then the Joseonjok's income was much higher than that of the Han Chinese. So really the modeling through process depended on what assets each group brought to Qingdao. For example, Korean entrepreneurs brought capital and jobs to the city, and Han workers brought local and experiential knowledge and human capital. And then Joseonjok brought their mediating capacities, but as time went on, their role turned out to be replaceable or superfluous. So these mediators were losing out. And one irony was the example of one Korean company that was quite friendly to Joseonjok and Han workers. The Korean bosses in the company educated Joseonjok by letting them borrow books and read them during working hours, and then they allowed that to Han workers as well, because they believed that workers' self-improvement is important. But as a result, some Han Chinese workers started learning Korean, and the Korean CEOs learned Chinese. So they didn't need Joseonjok mediators any longer. So Joseonjok mediators, managers lost jobs, and some of them started their own businesses using their transnational status and experiences. But most of them, they started a business in similar or in the very same enterprises where they used to work, and then they had a contract to provide the supplies or components to the Korean company where they used to work. In the process, some of them migrated to South Korea to work, and then some of them started their businesses. Joseonjok's transnationalism, like I am here and there at the same time, has been transformed to I am neither here nor there. And about that, one interviewee called Joseonjok the people with luggage. This interviewee was a quite a successful businessman, and he was a Joseonjok. He was serious about this issue, and he said, I wonder why Joseonjok are so mobile, moving from one place to another, from one job to another. I think we Joseonjok are insecure and anxious. We don't feel that China is our country after all, nor is South Korea, nor North Korea. That's why we desperately accumulate money, so that we can build our own kingdom. That's very sad. And if you think about it, many more and more people are becoming like that. Their belongingness becomes weak because they have been moving around. So this going through various changes in the context of a conflict and cooperation between the nation states with which they have significant ties, they have been driven to be highly mobile. And in a way, it is their strategy to survive in this constantly changing and precarious conditions of the society. So I want to conclude discussing the intertwined relationship between ethnicity and the state. And that kind of context needed to be more deeply explored in the future. And then the roles of agents, the roles of specific actors are significant because they are the agents, mediators. They are the nodes of transnational practices involving a variety of actors from different cultures in the region. So further studies would be necessary. And then I want to argue that such transnationalism within precarious social conditions become increasingly common in the contemporary society. So this study has an implication not only for Joseonjok migrants or for transnational migrants, but also for the general population. And then this kind of a modeling through process will be the form of a people's response to social changes in many ways. Thank you.